Welcome to the channel. I'm David W. Poe. Let me introduce you to the supplies that we'll be using in today's demonstration. I use the Cobra line of water mixable oils and a limited palette. Starting off with my yellow, which is Permanent Yellow Light. I only buy the 150 milliliter tubes. That's the cheapest and most economical way to do this. For my red, I use Madder Lake. And for my blue, Ultramarine. And then one additional earth tone. This is Burnt Umber. And of course, Titanium White. I also use the Cobra Quick Drying Medium. The 75 milliliter, by the way, fits nicely into a French easel. This is the Liquitex Freestyle palette knife, diamond shape. Then I'm not quite sure what you call this rubber tip tool, but I use that to sign my paintings. And I also use a set of brushes, the Ashley Princeton line. This is an economical hog bristle, natural hog bristle flat brush. That's a size 8, 6, and 4. And then I also have today a Princeton Imperial number 4 round. And I also carry an Aspen line. This is also made by Princeton liner, size 2. And I will also have a fan brush, although that one's not in great shape. I don't think I'll be using it today. And then a collapsible water dish. And then here is my painting surface, 11 by 14. This is by U.S. Art Supply, their Liberty series. And I've already pre-stained it with red oxide, transparent red oxide, also from the Cobra line, and made sure that was completely dry. In the back, you'll see I use 2 standard little clips that you might get at an office store to hold my plastic bag for my trash, and that'll fit right through the middle of the easel. And then I've got a 2-inch and a 1-inch chip brush rather, and then an old toothpaste brush, and then some cotton swabs that are great for taking out paint off of your canvas, and then the viewfinder. If I was out in the field, this is very handy to use to see protect a subject matter. All right, well, let's get started today. So I've got my Titanium White, my Permanent Yellow Light, my Madder Lake, and my Ultramarine Blue. I always line them up in the same way, and I make sure I squeeze out enough. And then Burnt Umber, and then my Quick Dry Medium. Always make sure you've got a good amount of paint on the palette. This will help you to put more paint on the painting surface. Too often, beginners start with small little dabs and then wonder why they have so much difficulty painting. I begin with my dark, which is a mixture of ultramarine blue and the Madder Lake. Sometimes I'll use ultramarine blue and the burnt umber to create the dark, but here I'm going with a very dark purple. And I believe this is the number 4 brush that I'm using, the flat hog bristle brush. In fact, in today's demonstration, you'll notice that I don't switch paintbrushes too often. Here I'm just getting my initial sketch in. Some artists will do this on paper, make a little thumbnail sketch before they move to putting down the sketch on the painting surface. I like to just dive right in and put that initial drawing right on the painting surface. It's easy enough to wipe off if I make a mistake, and we can always adjust it later on if needed. Notice that I hold the painting brush from the tip end. This allows a little bit better flow, and you get a little bit more of a natural stroke instead of a forced stroke from it. Then notice that I'm using those front clips for the panel board. This makes it really secure, easier to paint on. Maybeth full easel is what I use, both for the studio and then also in the field. And that way I am getting used to the equipment every time I paint, whether it's outdoors or in the studio. And that can be very helpful. Here, just continuing to lay in the dark shapes off of a photo reference of a pond here in Franklin County, Missouri. Today's focus is on showing you what a limited palette can do for you and how you can make a very realistic painting with a limited set of colors and without fussy detail. So that first purple line you see near the top of the painting surface, that's kind of the boundary line for the foliage, the trees I'm going to be working on today. And now here, once again, I'm trying to pick out the darkest darks that I see in the various foliage, trees, etc., that are in this particular landscape. Trying to vary the brush strokes. A lot of this will get covered up, but it is helpful to give me a roadmap for what will come next. My focal point is going to be a set of trees pretty much in the middle of this painting surface, which, as you may already know, that's a little bit risky, but we'll see if I'll be able to pull it off. Oftentimes the focal point, if you divide up the painting surface into thirds, a third from the top, a third from the bottom, and then across, within the square that's formed in the very middle of the painting surface is where you're often told to place the focal point at one corner of that box that is formed when you divide each part by thirds. If you have the focal point right in the middle of your painting surface, oftentimes it becomes just a painting about that thing that's in the center, and your eye goes straight to it without really looking at the rest of the painting. And so that is the danger. Many paintings have either 2/3 dark or 1/3 dark. Here, I guess I would estimate that this is about a 2/3 dark painting with a few highlights. We're going to be really concentrating on some darker tones in this realistic fall landscape piece. I use shop towels to wipe off the excess paint, removing most of that, but oftentimes I won't use the water to clean it at this point. I'll just dip it in some of my quick dry medium and get started with another mixture. So here's some titanium white. I'm adding some of the dark to it to create a nice purple. And I'm going to put a little bit of ultramarine blue into that mixture. And this is going to be part of the sky color I'm going to use today to accentuate the darker tones. And I'm also going to paint into the darks at this point that have formed the boundary of my foliage. So you'll see that here. And I'm trying to lay in just pieces of paint. to sort of give me an outline of where the sky begins and where the foliage begins. And once again, trying to vary some of those brush strokes. Painting's all about contrast, lights, darks, tonal values. And oftentimes, because of that, it's difficult to judge values until you really have the entire canvas covered with paint. And so one of the early goals is to paint as quickly as possible and get those initial middle values, if you will, on the painting surface, and then to go back in and do your corrections. Here, a little bit more titanium white with a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of the quick dry medium. Titanium white is a slow drying pigment, so you really need that. And now I've eliminated the purple, and I'm coming in with a stronger blue near the top of the sky. I'm going to leave a little line here, and what I like to do is come back in later as that paint is dried a little bit, and then I will work in some clouds, or at least a little bit of variation, using a dry brush technique. Once again, varying my strokes. I do like to use vertical strokes for the sky, most of the time at least. And part of the reason for that, it helps eliminate some of the glare, which is possible. Here again, you can see I hope you can see, just a little bit of variety between that blue and then the purple. They're the same tonal value. And so I'm looking for some very modest changes in color while keeping the tonal value the same. And that usually helps to produce a very beautiful painting. Many times, beginners are in love with too much color, and so we make the contrast too sharp. And that's how we end up with what some may criticize as cartoonish landscapes, or landscapes that don't seem very real. Of course, sometimes I will paint landscapes like that just because I don't want it to be real. I'm looking for something different or unique. Today, I'm really trying to focus on presenting a more realistic landscape for those of you that really like realism. I'm going to hopefully, or at least attempt to suggest to you that you can get a very realistic looking landscape with less effort by using the same techniques I've shown you in the past videos and what I'm showing you here. Notice how loose I'm putting these paints down and trying not to mess with it too much. I just put the pieces of paint down and leave it. So this is a pond area, and so I just darkened that purple mixture that I used for the skies just enough to indicate a little bit difference, because your lightest zone is going to, of course, be the sky. And then the next lightest is going to be your horizontal plane for the land. And then finally, the uprights, or the verticals, which would be your trees and other foliage. And since I already had sky color on my palette mixed, it's easy to vary the tone, the intensity of the color rather. And when you mix your puddles of color within each other in those circles, you save space on the palette, and it's easier for you to see the difference in the tonal value, whether it's darker or lighter than the other color that you just put down, especially when you're dealing with shifts. you'll notice that we're using only one of each of the primaries, and so it's all about shifting those colors with the mixtures. And in almost each mixture that we're making for this painting, we're using all three of the primaries. I would also encourage beginners, don't turn to titanium white too soon. Notice that I haven't used too much titanium white yet. I used a little bit in the sky, and I kept that as a separate pool of color. Now we're going in with a reddish brown mixture using the Madder Lake, a little bit of the yellow permanent light, and also a little bit of the ultramarine blue. Like I said, many of the mixtures, it's just shifting that color to one of the primaries. And of course, the more you add of the opposite color, the more you gray down that color. Or through the brush, less intense brush strokes will make the color a little bit lighter. Or in this case, in using water mixable oils, taking a little bit of the water and watering down that pigment just a little bit produces a little bit of a difference in the shade here. So you notice I'm taking that red and then buttressing it up against the purple mixtures. In the late fall especially, you get a lot of reds and browns left. And so that is what I find in my reference photo. And here I'm making it a little bit more brown by the introduction of more of the permanent yellow light. Just variations of my strokes at this point. And at the very top of those, the foliage or the tree, what they're going to become the trees, I just vary the amount of pressure that I'm putting down when I'm just barely touching the painting surface when I come to those edges to produce a little bit more of a light, feathery type atmosphere to kind of suggest that there's less mass in that color, less mass because there's fewer leaves that we're looking through, or tree limbs, etc. Now I've put some more of the primary yellow, permanent yellow, into that mixture as I'm varying this brown even more and going back in to this background. Once again, varying the pressure at the very top of these lines. And I think you can see how subtle the color shift is. Almost the same tonal value, but a different color. And at this point, I'm just trying to cover the canvas and approximate the colors that I'm seeing as I remember that landscape, and as also I use the reference photo a little bit to remind myself of the basic shapes or composition of the layout. Once again, softening the edge on the top of these trees by using a little bit more water in the mixture of the oils. Now I'm taking some titanium white, just a little bit, to lighten that brownish mixture. And so a little bit, once again, a different tone of brown. Which will become part of the foliage. And a little bit of the hillside, which is right underneath of these trees. Trying to just lay it down and leave it alone. When you see a mass of just one color, it's always more interesting to break those shapes up further. And so sometimes you'll take one color that's in one area of your painting and make sure to place it in other sections of the painting so that way it builds a sense of harmony while also providing a little bit of detail, or at least your mind sees it as detail. By the way, now would be a good time to remind you, if you like the content, if you could please subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up. I have produced other videos at this point, and you may be interested in them as well. There'll be links at the very end of this video, so please hang with me. If you're interested in learning how to paint clouds, water, other types of landscapes, you can check out my channel and the other videos that I have. Here is a very olive or dull green, created with all three of the primary colors. Once again, just shifting towards the green spectrum now, with ultramarine blue, the Madder Lake, as well as the permanent yellow light. And this is the kind of green that you have around the fall in this type of area. It's not very intense. Notice how subtle it is. It's very close to the other colors that it is around, and that's intentional. We don't need this green to sit back farther, because it's on the same plane as these other leaves and other shapes. And notice how that brings some relief to the reds. Just a little bit of that green really, really helps the eye to see that as foliage, as grassland. Still using that green, but varying it a little bit towards the brown shade now, as I've placed a little bit more yellow in it, as well as ultramarine. Now here I'm looking for a little bit more intense, darker green as it gets closer to the viewer. Things pick up sharpness and more local color as we get closer to the viewer. And of course, when you do change the color, it's always good to use just a little bit of the oil. You can always come back for more until you get the mixture just right, but it's very difficult if you put too much of one color into the other, and and you try to use it, you're going to force yourself to use it, and then you can run into a lot of problems really quick. And see how that this more intense green helps us to see this landscape as sitting back, so that lighter green is obviously farther away from us. That shoreline over there on the other side of the pond is becoming more visible as being farther away from us, whereas this more intense green of this side of the shoreline is obviously closer to the viewer. This might also be a good time to see and to remind you that at various stages of oil painting, the painting's not going to look all that good. If you attempt to make one little section perfect and then move on to another little section and try to make it perfect, it just doesn't work that way. Your painting will look labored. It will have less painting harmony, less of a sense of the looseness of the brush strokes. And so hold off on judgment. Keep working at it. And eventually, you'll begin to see the detail. Here I've just toned down that green a little bit more with some titanium white. Just a very little bit of titanium white, by the way, and a little bit of the permanent yellow light. Now you can tell I've almost covered the canvas for the first coat of paint, if you will. And in just a minute, you'll probably see me work into that pond area. When you're doing water, the strokes need to go in a vertical fashion. And that will help the eye read it as water as opposed to something else. So here I'm creating a kind of an aqua green color, at least as the first base color for that pond, as it is reflecting some of the greens, which would be darker, from the shoreline. And I'm going to gently take those pieces of green aqua paint and brush them downwards into the sky color that I had placed already into this pond area. Once again, short vertical strokes. And I'll be varying that color a little bit later on. You may be wondering and thinking, well, aren't those trees brown and orange? Why are you going in with green first? Well, there's green on that shoreline as well, and I want that to be reflected, and it would be a little bit darker, whereas the browns and the reds are going to be reflected as a little lighter. And now you can see I'm actually taking some of that brown and gently mixing it on the top of that green to give a sense of some of these various colors. And now I pretty much have the canvas now, the canvas panel board, covered with the first coat of paint. And now we'll go back in and start working on the smaller shapes and the details. Well, not much in the way of details, but working on the edges and further refining these shapes so that they do become the trees and other structures in the landscape. Here I'm wiping off my brush. I'm going to get ready to work on the sky first. That's usually my process, is once I've covered the canvas, is to go back now from top to bottom and begin working on the refining the shapes. Actually, from this viewpoint, it almost looks like I've got enough cloud structures in there. If I had waited, I might not have actually put paint down and let that underpainting show through like I have it here. But as it is, I'm taking some titanium white, which is much too cold to just put on the painting without mixing it with something. And so I've added some permanent yellow light to that mixture to provide it with some. And now I'm just sort of randomly placing that using my prior map, which was to leave some bare spots for where these clouds would come in, and putting some of those shapes into the sky. Trying to vary my brush strokes. Come back and get some more paint so that it'll show up a little bit. And now I'm going to dry that brush off. I'm going to go back in and work on basically blending these colors into one another. And then I will, here's the dry brush. So this is a change of brushes now. And this has nothing on it. It's just a dry brush. This really does work the best, I think. And then you'll see me periodically take this brush, and then if I get too much of that paint back on the bristles, I will wipe it off with the shop towel. So now I'm just trying to randomly provide some shapes, thinking about the fact that the underside of the clouds will be a little bit darker naturally than the top. And I'm noticing that I'm kind of obliterating some of that white a little bit too much. And so I will come back in at one point with some more of the titanium white and permanent yellow light mixture. But first I'm going to soften these edges with this dry brush technique, creating some of these clouds. Once again, you'll see me just kind of trying to give you the sense of air moving and the cloud moving ever so slightly. I don't want hard edges in the sky. Hard edges, by the way, draw your attention. They draw your eye. And so that's why you really, unless the subject matter is the clouds, you want to soften the edges of these clouds so that way we provide some variety up there, but that's not the focal point. Here's where I'm reestablishing some of the lights on the top of the clouds and using the purples and the blues for the underside. By the way, if you're still tuned in, I hope, if you've got ideas for other videos that you would like me to produce, let me know in the comments. Perhaps there's another subject you would like me to tackle. I also have some videos that are tutorials and product reviews. So if there's something you would like me to review on this channel, I'd be happy to look into that. I got into landscape painting when I was almost 50 years old. So I hope that I can be an inspiration for you. If you are someone who has never painted before and you're a little bit older like me, you can really start oil painting at any age.
Young or old?
And it's really not about talent. I would be the first one to tell you that I do not have any natural talent. I really had to work. I struggled. The first couple of years that I painted abstracts with acrylic paints because I was just certain that I really could not paint very well. So the only thing that I thought I could do was abstracts. I also soon discovered that abstract painting is actually much more challenging than you would think. It's not simply taking a bunch of different paints and splashing it on a canvas. I guess you could do that, and I did do that, but the paintings were horrible. Eventually, I decided that I wanted to become a plein air painter, outdoor painter, and I liked Impressionism, although strictly speaking, I'm not an impressionistic painter. The Impressionists would, I blend my colors too much to really be called an Impressionist. Impressionists would put dots of color, if you will. Pointillism is part of the Impressionistic painting history of allowing the viewer's eyes to mix the colors as opposed to you mixing them. Anyhow, when I made that switch, I began using oils and experimenting with oils. Over several years, I really used a lot of different colors, a lot of different brands to figure out what I really wanted to use. I've used Gamblin oils, I've used Lucas oils, I've used Winton. And today, at the current moment at least, I've settled on using the water mixable oils from Cobra, which is made by Royal Talons, simply because I wanted to get away from using mineral spirits in my small space. I worry a little bit about ventilation. And so the prospect of being able to paint with oil, but not have to smell any chemicals was really a plus. I will say that the Cobra quick drying medium obviously has some fumes to it, but I cannot tell. It doesn't have much of a smell to me. It is a nice liquidy medium. It is nothing like Liquin. I use Liquin, which is a very good dryer, but it smells horrible. And you really should only use that outside. And so I wanted to get away from Liquin as well. And some of the other dryers that I found very, very difficult to breathe. Here's a darker mixture of brown. As you can see, I've been varying the tops of these trees to give you the sense that there's more air, more sky peeking through the tops. But now I need to go back in and establish some of my darks. The key to oil painting, or if you're using other media, whether it be watercolor or acrylics, is just painting. It's good to watch these videos. Obviously, I hope you continue to watch my videos. And I can tell you that that's part of my practice too, is watching a lot of other people paint, even if they are not the same style as me. I might not even particularly like the style, but there is something about watching other people paint that can help you to pick up some new techniques, some different ways about mark making on a canvas that may very well influence your painting. One thing that I've noticed about watching other painters is that I sometimes really enjoy watching folks that are very different than me. And then when I try to paint like them, it's a complete disaster. So sometimes you have to figure out, do I like the paintings that are produced by this particular artist? Or do I want to paint in that style? And sometimes you come up with two completely different answers to that question. Here I'm using some burnt umber mixed with some ultramarine blue to create some of the mud, if you will, on the edge of this pond, and to once again give some more depth, set back some of the other colors by using this as more of the foreground, along with some of the remaining deep purples. Here, just creating a couple of shapes that will become some foliage that will be closer to the viewer as the painting progresses. And you'll notice at this point, you're probably thinking, well, those masses of red and brown, they still don't look like trees. Well, that's important to note, is that in my technique, I find it much easier to focus on the colored shapes, these larger shapes, and then move to smaller and smaller details as the painting progresses. When we get to the tree details, I'm going to mix up a mixture of the ultramarine blue and the madder lake for a deep dark purple, which is even more darker really than black is. And then I am going to take my liner, my Princeton Aspen size 2 liner, and a little bit of the Royal Talons Cobra drier medium, and put that on my liner and begin to make some branches and tree trunks that will sit on top of these larger shapes. And you will see how convincing that will make these larger shapes. And so with minimal effort, you can actually produce pretty high realism, I would say. I don't know that all those titles really help us sometimes. Like I mentioned, I like Impressionism. This seems like partly Impressionism to me, but historically speaking, I know that there are differences. Notice how your eyes, I hope, are turning some details here as the picture is coming together. The painting, I think, is coming together with these different colored masses. But notice at this point, we only got a little bit of time left, and there's no detail yet. And that's by design. And it will really help your painting if you don't give in to the temptation of putting a lot of detail in at first. Save the smaller little brushstrokes till the very end, and you'll be amazed. Here I'm coming in with some of the darker reds again that are going to sit on the top. And here's where I started to kind of outline certain shapes of these trees to distinguish one from the other. And then by darkening, notice something, then the red becomes more intense. Many people try to get more intense colors by lightening the color. Oftentimes, that's the wrong approach. Try the darks first and use the lights very sparingly. And when I'm talking about lights, I'm primarily talking about when you're tempted to put titanium white into the mixture to lighten something up, which actually makes most of your colors colder or cooler than the others, right? Because white is a very cool color. Here I'm continuing to add some darker shades coming towards the viewer because I don't want your focus to be on the foreground. I want you to experience the foreground as being closer to you, but I don't want it to be the star of the show. I want you to draw you in with these darker shapes so that your attention is going to be on the area of highest contrast, where you see the darkest darks and the lightest lights. Now here I'm going to show you, I'm going to make a more intense red using the Madder Lake and making another little pile of color over here. I'm going to work in a little bit of the yellow into that red. I never use the colors straight from the tube usually. It's got to be some kind of a mixture. So I'm trying to knock down that red a little bit with the yellow to create a little bit more of an orangey red, or a red that leans towards the orange family. And now I'm going to go into where the contrast is going to show up with those darker darks I already put in. And notice that the red is popping out, but it's not because I added titanium white, which would have made this mixture very unnatural, if you would ask me. And I'm allowing the darks to work for me to provide more contrast in the reds. And notice the subtle shift in the tonal value here. It's basically the same tonal value as those darks, but because of the different color shift, it stands out in relationship to it. So here I'm just trying to soften some of those edges, suggesting a few different shapes, but a sense hopefully that this is a tree mass. Now I'm adding some of the darks on the other side. Sorry that my hand's covering up some of the pictures on that, but kind of difficult to show you every brush stroke when you're trying to paint loosely like this. And notice again, we're now at about 18 minutes away from the finish of this painting, and still It's not about detail. It's about reestablishing these shapes and working now into the larger masses some additional smaller shapes. And by that, we're talking about these different colors being worked into the painting. And as you apply more paint to the first layer that we had worked down, it's important to realize that you're using a little bit thicker paint on the brush. Now, this is also a technique called alla prima, which means all at once. So I'm not going to be painting again tomorrow. I'm not going to go back into these colors again. I am attempting to put down everything in one go, basically, which means that I don't have to worry as much about the fat over lean method, which is that if you're going to be painting over different sittings, then you need to start with a very lean mixture, using more mineral spirits or water in this case, in those lower paint levels, and then adding more paint on top of it. That becomes very important if you're doing this in stages, or if you were plein air painting with a large canvas and you were returning to the site over multiple days, then you may have to be concerned about that. The fat over lean method, which means that you're putting more oil into it. So in other words, in the subsequent layers, if you were painting over a series of days, you would apply a little bit more linseed oil or quick dry medium in the additional layers of paint that you are doing in consecutive days. Here's a mixture of the permanent yellow light and a little bit of the Madder Lake, and this is producing a little bit more of a brighter orange. And you'll see how this looks as I'm going to go in over some of the other colors that are in the surface at this point, right along the edge of this pond. Once again, a light pressure on the brush. I'm trying to erase some of the spots that to me looked a little bit too pink because of the underpainting, which was that transparent red oxide. I'm covering all of that up at this point. Appreciate you staying and watching all of this video. I hope this has been helpful to you. Once again, if you like the content, please give me a thumbs up, and I do hope that you'll subscribe to the channel. If you would be interested in purchasing my paintings, I have a website, davidwpoe.org, and you can see more of my work there. And currently, this is 2022, November, I'm selling most of my work still on eBay. So you can go to eBay and in the search menu, put David W. Poe or David Wesley Poe, and you'll be able to find me. Now here's the liner, and once again, this is a mixture of ultramarine blue and the Madder Lake to create a very dark purple. And now I am going back into these masses and creating the trunks and the limbs of the trees, starting from the base, applying a lot of pressure, and then easing on the pressure as I go up, as I pull the brush upwards. And I'm allowing the brush to kind of do the work for me so that it creates a sense of natural flow. as opposed to me forcing anything. And notice how just with these few strokes, I'm beginning to provide just enough detail for the viewer now to make out those shapes as, in fact, trees of a forest next to a small pond. Whereas previously, it just looked like batches of color. And then trying to vary the branches coming upwards using pressure so that in some places I sort of want the branches and the brushes to kind of disappear. In other places, I want you to be able to see a little bit more of the detail. And then it's a matter of here I'm just trying to get a little bit more variety. And then pretty soon I'm going to do a little bit more work to make sure that the trunks of the trees really do look like they're grounded. Think of any tree that you know the tree becomes thicker at the very base, especially as it connects to the earth. It kind of expands in size, as well as in some of the shadows underneath the trees. And so we're going to get that here. What I was doing was taking a little bit of that purple mixture and just loosely sticking that in there in the tops of the trees. So that way it gives the illusion that there's lots of little branches going on without having to paint a bunch of branches. And also over the edges of these masses so that there's a gentleness in terms of how those colors are mixing with one another. And of course, one of your best brushes is simply your finger to remove something or to soften it, soften the shapes. Here, that's what I'm doing, and trying to establish those trunks, make them kind of disappear as they go deep into the ground. Establishing some of the shadow shapes underneath the trees. In this reference, there's also a kind of a dead tree that's sticking out of the others. And so in just a minute, you'll see me begin to work on that, which will extend past the canvas, going through the sky. It's kind of a risky move because it may take the viewer's eyes completely off the canvas if I do that. But I do think it provides a little bit more detail, a little bit more of an area of interest, highlighting the main focal area, which is the grouping of trees there with the dark red. Taking some of the burnt umber mixture. It's been mixed with a little bit of the Madder Lake. And I'm going to, here we go. Here's the branches that are peeking through, going up past the the sky area here. More pressure at the very bottom, becoming less as I move up. And then I want to give the illusion that there's a few little leaves attached to some of this. So I'm going to take a little bit of that brown, stick it on some of these branches as I kind of erase a few of them. And then, of course, I use my finger to soften that effect. And then I'm going to go back in with a few darker notes, but not too dark. And now I'm going to intentionally go through some of these colored shapes and use the liner brush to break some of those colors up by introducing a few more colors or tones. And notice how close so many of these values are. And by doing that, I think it helps to create the illusion of realism. Because really in nature, the color shifts are very subtle, even in the fall. We may like bold colors and we may like things to really stand out, but if we're very observant, a lot of the colors are very, very close together. And in this painting, that's what we've worked on, creating the illusion of realism using some color shifts, etc. Here I'm taking that liner now, introducing some different colors, some darker tones, some lighter tones, to give the sense of some foliage being here, but not such that it calls too much attention to itself. I'm going to be doing a few of those down here. Give a sense of some longer grasses down here. There we go. You notice that it's going up into the area of the pond that we're seeing. Now, to help the viewer really get into the painting, the last little detail I'm going to use here in a minute is to put a little path with what's going to eventually be basically my lightest light, at least on the ground plane. Here I'm making sure that there's a little bit of variety on the tops of these trees, indicating a few branches, that stick out more than the others. Trees are very imperfect. They certainly don't look like ice cream cones. Sometimes trees look like that to me on certain paintings. So I want to make sure that the shapes that I haven't repeated a shape anywhere, that each of the foliage shapes are unique stand on their own, and that the shapes really are varied and not simply a repeat. Here I'm creating this mixture for the path, a light brown with titanium white and burnt umber and a little bit of the purple mixture, which would be ultramarine blue and Madder Lake. So once again, it's got almost every color in it. And now I'm going to take this path basically around the pond to show where human beings would be walking or treading if they're going fishing, that kind of thing. Very little pressure, very varying the shapes here. I don't want it to look too man-made. And I don't want the edges to be too sharp. And so I'm going to refine that a little bit, and notice how I'm holding the brush and pulling the brush sideways to create the effect that I want. Creating a couple of areas, suggesting a little bit of a sandy, or at least a little bit lighter brown dirt patch with less green grass growing, right? This is the fall. Now I'm going to try to clean up that one edge on the other side of the pond there a little bit more, and bringing some of that color down here. It's sort of hidden, but gives some refinement to the foliage shapes. Just a little bit of detail, you see, without distracting you too much. And after a couple more strokes, you'll see me sign the painting. So thank you again for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel. Give me a thumbs up if you've liked the content. And be sure to watch my other videos. There I got back up and took a look at the painting to make sure I was happy with it. And now I'm going to go ahead and sign my name after I clear up a little spot here that was left unpainted because of the bracket holding the painting in place. This is just a little rubber edged tool that I find very handy to use to go back into the paint and just basically remove the paint and allow the underpainting to show. And there it is.